Chinese Communist Party has colonized regions that once belonged to other cultures, like Xinjiang, where Uyghurs live, and Tibet, where Tibetans live. But did you know about Southern Mongolia? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The country of Mongolia. It's famous for horseback riding, yurts, and throat singing. But there's a second Mongolia, Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, which is a province of China. And it's famous for human rights abuses. Well, not so famous for that actually, and that's part of the problem. Matt Geneza sat down with Engpak Togchog from the Southern Mongolia Human Rights Information Center to learn more.
Thanks for joining me today, Engpak.
You're welcome.
So there are really two Mongolias. There's the country of Mongolia and the Chinese region of Inner Mongolia, or what you call Southern Mongolia.
Correct.
I mean, besides obviously one being a country and one being a province of China, what are the big differences?
Well, historically they were one nation. There's no two Mongolia. It was only starting 1949 when the People's Republic of China was established. Southern Mongolia, also known as Inner Mongolia, was annexed to China. So in history, they are part of the greater Mongolian nation.
Right. I mean, under the Qing dynasty, if you look at maps from the height of the Qing dynasty, which was like 1644 to 1911,
correct.
Mongolia, the entire Mongolia, was part of China at the time.
Well,
according to the maps, right?
Well, according to the map, there is a lot of issue with those maps, and then there's a lot of problem with the terminology that they used by many scholars, even in the West. For example, Qing dynasty is not Chinese. Is Manchu's Qing. It's not China's Qing, right? So, well, more precisely, actually, the Qing dynasty is a joint rule of Mongolians and the Manchu over the larger territory, not only including China, but also many other territories, including Mongolia, was a part of Qing. So,
I mean, the Manchus had actually taken over part of Mongolia before they moved into the rest of China.
Well, they were, before 1644, Manchus and Mongolians were neighbors, and they had a very good relationship, especially the Manchus with the Southern Mongolia, eastern part of Southern Mongolia, where they had a very close relationship. And so even the founder of Qing dynasty, Norhach himself, claimed himself as a descendant of a Mongolian Khan, Timur Khan. So they at the beginning of the Qing dynasty, it was really, Manchu really considered themselves as a legitimate descendant of Mongolian nation.
So really, China has been part of Mongolia for hundreds of years.
Yes, that was during the the Mongolian Empire. China was just one province of greater Mongolian.
Right, so China's
Empire.
been part of Mongolia since ancient times, right? That's
well,
the way to phrase it, I think.
But now the Chinese are claiming that Mongolia, not only Mongolia, Tibet, and also Uyghurs were part of China from the long time ago, since the few thousand years ago, but which is not true. I mean, the Mongolia actually is a separate nation. If you look at the history between Mongolia and China, right, there's a Great Wall between Mongolia and China.
Right, the Great Wall is sort of at the southern border of what today is the Chinese Inner Mongolia.
Yes, Great Wall is actually the real true historical boundary between the Mongolian nation and Chinese nations. And not only the national boundary, but also it's a boundary of two civilizations. Like north of the Great Wall is nomadic civilization, which is totally different from the agricultural civilization in the south. And not only that, it's a it's boundary of two different climate. If you look at the climate of Mongolian plateau, which is totally different from Chinese. So it's a real boundary between Mongolian, historical boundary between Mongolian nation and Chinese nation.
Yeah, and I didn't actually know this until I met you. I met you at a Tibetan event,
right?
And it kind of struck me that maybe what Mongolians and people in the Chinese region of Inner Mongolia are going through is a little bit similar to what Tibetans and the Uighur Muslims in Xinjiang are going through in terms of being separate with languages and separate culture, separate identity, regions that have historically not been part of the Chinese heartland.
Right. So yes, first of all, the term, I would like to say a few words on the terminology that you use, Inner Mongolia. You also use a terminology about Southern Mongolia.
Ne Mungu in
yes,
Chinese.
Ne Mungu. The term Inner Mongolia is highly propagandistic, and it's highly Sinocentric terminology of a direct translation of the Chinese term called Ne Mungu. It's implying that this part of Mongolia is integral part of China or inner part of China. So there's a territorial claim with this terminology, and so and then on the other hand, if you look at the history of Mongolia, if you look at the map of Mongolia, so when you say inner, you are standing in Beijing or heartland of China, and then it looks to the Chinese. The Southern Mongolia looks inner, and then Northern Mongolia looks like outer. But if you look at the if you stand in Mongolia and look at the map, then it's inner is actually the independent country of Mongolia should be inner, and Southern Mongolia is outer. And actually, there is a very interesting book published in early 20th century by Danish traveler. His name is Henning Haslund. The book is entitled In Secret Mongolia. There's a very interesting map published in the book showing that Inner Mongolia is independent country of Mongolia. Outer Mongolia is Southern Mongolia. So it's really depend on from whose perspective you look at the map. So, but we traditionally never say ourselves as inner, because there's no reason for us to say inner and outer. We just, the term Southern Mongolia is from the Mongolian word Uighur Mongol. All Mongolians still use today Uighur Mongol, which means Southern Mongolia, south of Gobi Desert. Northern Mongolia, which is independent country of Mongolia, Outer Mongol. That's it. There's no political meaning whatsoever of inside of which country. This is just geographical terminology, but now used by the Chinese as inner, which is our land, inside of China, outer, which is outside of China. That's why it's a very Sinocentric terminology.
Yeah, it sounds like the Chinese government is using maps and terminology as a way to solidify its own historical narrative.
Yes, definitely. It's Chinese, always if you look at the Chinese history, right? Real China is really small. The Chinese heartland is very small.
I mean, it's mostly between the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south, right?
Yeah, that's why it's sometimes it's like some scholars, even in the West, is unknowingly use the term of referring to Qing as China. This is, it's good for the Chinese. I mean, of course, they happily take that to legitimize their territorial claim over those, Mongolia, East Turkestan, Tibet. They were never part of China. The Chinese nation was really small. As you mentioned, it's just the basin, the Yellow River basin. That's their ancestral land.
So I noticed you're wearing this pin. the blue pin, what is that?
This is a national flag of Southern Mongolia.
It's a national flag
Yes.
of a region that's not actually a nation right now.
Well, yes, you're correct. The independent country of Mongolia has a different flag, but very similar. Fire, sun, moon. Yeah, they have this also, but this is specifically for Southern Mongolia.
So you think Southern Mongolia should be its own independent country?
Well, it was, and then up until 1949, it was an independent country.
Do you want to see it united with the Republic of Mongolia, or do you want to see two separate Mongolian countries?
Well, that is a very interesting question, and then it's a very it's like century-old topic. All the Mongolians, actually, from bottom of their heart, all Mongolians want to be united with the Southern Mongolians want to be united with the independent country of Mongolia. That was their dream. They've been fighting for this for many centuries, at least more than a centuries. If you look at the history in early 20th century, when Qing dynasty collapsed, Mongolia declared their independence in 1911. At that time, all Southern Mongolians, Southern Mongolian banners is just administrative unit, all Southern Mongolian banners just declared their willingness to unite with the independent country of Mongolia to become independent country. Right. So this attempt, this movement has never ended.
It's
today.
Interesting because like the country of Mongolia actually can thank the Soviet Union for helping it be independent from China, but that only ended up becoming the northern part, right, which is now the country of Mongolia, but that never included, under the Soviet deal, never included Southern Mongolia.
Correct. So that the narrative, for example, Soviet Union helped.
The Soviet Union never really helps, right? I mean,
no, it's actually it was.
They do like to kill people. I think is part of the problem.
Exactly. It's actual independence of Mongolia. I would say like the restoration of independence, because Mongolia was independent country in history, before Qing dynasty, and so after Qing dynasty collapsed, it was really not declaration of independence. It's just restoration of their independence, because Mongolia had been an independent country for so many years, so many centuries. So. Yes, the independent country of Mongolia is a small portion of it, Greater Mongolia, actually. If you look at the maps, the Southern Mongolian territory is even larger than the independent country of Mongolia.
It's also got a lot more people.
Yes.
Right? I mean, Mongolia, the country, only has, about 3 million?
Not even, close to 3 million.
And Inner Mongolia has 20-something million,
so
right?
Southern Mongolia has the Mongolian population in Southern Mongolia is about 6 million.
So that's like twice the population of the entire country of Mongolia.
Yes, and then the Mongolia is not only Southern Mongolia and Northern Mongolia, but also there's a large part of Mongolia within Russia. Now it's called Buryat Republic, and then Tova, northwestern part of Mongolia. That's also the Mongolian nation, and then there's also another nation called Kalmyk in Russia and Europe.
Right. So this is all the Mongolian plateau, essentially.
Yes, they were from the same nation. They speak the same language. Even today, we have no problem communicating with each other. So we are same people, one people. But the problem is, during the Second World War, there was a notorious treaty called Yalta Treaty. So those superpowers, Russia, Soviet Union, and Britain, and then America, they had a treaty to maintain the status quo, meaning independent country of Mongolia should be kept as an independent, but under the Soviet Union's influence. But Southern Mongolia must be kept under the Chinese jurisdiction. That's the treaty that really divided Mongolia into two parts.
So what's it like nowadays to be ethnically Mongolian living in China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, or what you call Southern Mongolia?
Southern Mongolia. So, Southern Mongolia is just like Tibet and East Turkestan is an occupied nation, occupied by the Chinese. It's a Chinese colony. So
happy ethnic minorities?
No, there's like
because state-run media told me that everyone was happy.
No. if you it's like as a second-class citizen, treated as like second-class citizen. We do not have any basic human rights. We do not have any fundamental freedoms, let alone political autonomy. So the people who demanded the autonomy. National autonomy, which was promised by the Chinese Communist Party, were now sent to jail and considered separatist, and their family members are imprisoned. For example, Mr. Hada, who in early 1990s demanded the autonomy, genuine autonomy, and self-determination, which is part of basic human rights.
China calls it the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, so it's therefore one of the least autonomous parts of
yes,
China, right?
It is the first, the so-called autonomous region set up by the Communist China, and then they, again, Southern Mongolia was always the guinea pig of Chinese ethnic policy, including the ethnic autonomy, which was experimented in Southern Mongolia first, and then they realized that this model works. So they used the same model in Tibet and in East Turkestan. So and then when there is every time when there is a political movement, especially toward the ethnic minorities, so-called ethnic minorities, it is experimented in Southern Mongolia. So, for example, during the 1960s and 70s,
because of Cultural Revolution.
During that period of time, the Chinese government carried out the large-scale genocide in Southern Mongolia. And then at that time, the total population of Southern Mongolia was 1.5 million, and 1/3 of the population was impacted. And then
they killed thousands and thousands of people.
They killed at least 100,000 Mongolians.
100,000
Mongolians, and then 500,000 were imprisoned, sent to jail, and tortured and maimed. So even Chinese government official statistics support this. 100,000 Mongolians were killed just for being who they are, just
basically
Mongolian.
for being their ethnicity.
Yes.
It's interesting because the Communist Party claims to be the party for all races and peoples, and then they're super racist against Mongolians, against Tibetans, against Uyghurs, right? It's just like they go by, what's the race of the person, and they persecute these groups.
I like the word, the racist you mentioned. Yes, it is. Chinese are the most racist people I have ever seen.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party, let's say.
If you look at the Chinese history, right? So Great Wall is there. It is the earliest evidence of racial segregation in human history. And it is testimony to the history between the Mongolians and the Chinese. So for thousands of years, the racial segregation is never new to the Chinese. If you look at the history, right, the Great Wall was built in 2,000 years ago. And then at that time, they already, racially segregate people. They call the people in the north as all barbarians, one word. And then, the Tibetans, Mongolians.
I think they were jealous because Mongolians are so good at wrestling.
Well, it's a part of Mongolian, tradition, right? The wrestling and Mongolians not only is like really, strong people, physically fit, but also it's a very, they good at, waging wars, and the Mongolians.
The horseback riding.
Yeah,
like
horseback
riding.
and the Mongolians are warrior people, and not only that, Mongolians are really good at conquering other nations and then administering the other nations. Actually, if you look at the Mongolian history in the 13th century, especially under the Kublai Khan's time, and in that time, Mongolia was actually international nation. It was very diverse, and then the capital of Mongolia had like probably just like modern day New York. There's so many
pizza.
Yes, everything, like all modern ideas. For example, the embassy, the passport, and the postal service.
In the 1200s?
All these religious freedom, world's first religious summit was held in the capital of Mongolia at that time. And then all major religion were freely debating, and then the Mongolia were really open-minded people, and not like the ones that described by the Chinese, and then Mongolians are barbarians, illiterate. No, the Mongolians are very open people, and they had a really amazing issue at that time.
But you're saying the Chinese Communist Party has been inaccurate in its descriptions, like it's been lying, perhaps?
Well, of course, it's not only inaccurate. There's a lot of racial discrimination in describing Mongolian history, portraying Mongolian history.
So, right now, people in Mongolia are saying, writers and dissidents are being locked up. They killed 100,000 people during the Cultural Revolution. What is life like right now for the average ethnically Mongolian person in southern Mongolia?
Okay, so imagine that, again, this is an occupied nation, right? Occupied territory. So people there are just treated as like second-class citizens. They don't have any freedom. They cannot claim themselves as Mongolian, because when you claim yourself Mongolian, when you highlight your identity, you considered as national separatist.
Okay, so like Mongolian, so the kids in southern Mongolia, do they learn, the Mongolian language in school? Are they doing different cultural things?
Starting 2001, Chinese government implemented a series of policies toward eliminating Mongolian traditional culture, language, way of life. And rural schools, Mongolian schools, were completely removed, or either removed or merged with the Chinese ones, and then kids, Mongolian children, are forced to study in Chinese. So where there are very few Mongolian schools, but it's really crowded. There's not many opportunities for Mongolians to learn in Mongolian. So there's a Chinese language is mandatory.
So how about the lifestyle in terms of, Mongolians have traditionally had a more nomadic lifestyle versus, for example, farming?
Well, so Mongolians were traditionally nomadic people. Up until very recently, they were able to practice their traditional way of life. But again, as I mentioned earlier, starting 2001, Chinese government implemented what is called ecological migration. The Chinese government came up with an idea that, the environmental degradation was caused by the Mongolian backward way of life, traditional way of life, so that they implemented the policy called ecological migration to move all the Mongolian herders from their ancestral land to agricultural and urban areas, claiming that they are, this is a part of their effort to restore the, Mongolian grassland ecosystem. In fact, who caused the actual environmental degradation was not the Mongolians.
I'm guessing it was the world's biggest polluter, the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes, it is, and then they destroyed Mongolian grassland. They opened up mines, and they practiced large-scale farming in southern Mongolia. So southern Mongolia is a very dry, arid or semi-arid area where there's not much rainfall. So once you open up the land, the topsoil is very thin. When you open it up, it becomes desert.
Like a couple seasons.
Exactly.
That's it, right?
Yeah, that's it. And so they even now, even Beijing is suffering from this, that desertification of southern Mongolia. The sandstorm.
Right.
That sandstorm is from southern Mongolia.
Southern Mongolia is only 200 miles from Beijing, right?
Well, you're very close to Beijing. That's another, misfortune of the Mongolian people. But there's, this geographical location. There's no option for us to, change this.
You can't get away from Beijing, basically.
Yeah, so the problem is, we were so close to the Chinese, even though there was a historical boundary, the Great Wall between us. But after the People's Republic of China was established, they just flooded the Mongolian grassland by the Chinese immigrants.
It's interesting. So, Beijing destroys the traditional nomadic way of life.
Yes.
And implements farming, which is totally unsustainable.
Right.
And then that ends up causing sandstorms.
And now
then the sandstorms affect Beijing.
Right.
So it's their karmic
Yes,
retribution.
yes, definitely. But they never admit that this was caused by them. They are saying that now, blaming on the Mongolian traditional way of life, claiming that the Mongolian traditional way of life destroyed this land.
All right. Well, it's tradition to blame the victim in communist China.
Yes, it is. It is. This is a good example of how they blame the victims.
So, what is the Southern Mongolia Liberation Movement?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Southern Mongolian liberation movement has never stopped, starting the early 20th century when the independent country of Mongolia restored the independence. All part of Southern Mongolia really, joined the movement. And then, 1930s, Southern Mongolia set up their own independent government, military, and then 1945, after the Second World War ended, Mongolia was partitioned into two Mongolia, right? Southern Mongolia became officially part of China, and Northern Mongolia became an independent country. And then, even after that, the independent movement had never stopped. And then, during the 50s, 60s, there were still people in people's mind, independence is a dream. And then during 1980s, Mongolians also, there was a large-scale student movement protesting the Chinese, immigration. And then 1990s, the number of organizations, underground organization. Of course, you cannot have a public, organization publicly, advocating for independence. So, but there were a number of organizations advocating for independence of Southern Mongolia. And as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Hata, who is the leader of this movement, is leader of the organization called Southern Mongolian Democratic Alliance. He was sentenced to 15 years in jail in 1995, and then he served the full sentence. And then after that, he was he was supposed to be released after serving the 15 years in jail, but he was not, and then he was again put under 4-year extrajudicial detention in a black jail.
Black jails, yeah.
And then after that, he was supposed to be released, right? But he was moved to another, apartment that run by the Chinese Public Security Bureau, and then he's confined in that apartment as, it's pretty much just a house arrest.
It's almost like there's no rule of law in China.
No, there is no rule of law.
So the liberation movement or the independence movement, I mean, because you hear about there's the Free Tibet independence movement, and there's an East Turkestan independence movement for Uyghurs.
Yes.
And then, so this is similar to those?
Yes, this is, there are not only inside Southern Mongolia, but also outside Southern Mongolia. There have been a number of organizations, movements, still very active.
Well, you're outside of Southern Mongolia, obviously.
Yes.
Lucky for you, because otherwise
Yes,
I'm
I'm the lucky one. Yes. We are unlucky. We under the Chinese, we were, my people are under the Chinese colonial regime, but personally, I'm lucky. I was able to get out of there and then enjoy freedom here. Yes, there are a number of organizations still very active in fighting for the freedom or independence of Southern Mongolia abroad.
So the Chinese Communist Party would label someone like you a dangerous separatist trying to split up China.
Yes.
Right? So is there another solution that doesn't require independence, a solution where you could have what you want but still be within the People's Republic of China?
Well, this is actually, history tells us that there's no other way to become, free under the Chinese colonial regime. So this is, to the Mongolians, to the Southern Mongolians and Tibetans and Uyghurs, same. It is not really the problem of communism, actually. This is colonialization. It's not communism. It's an issue of colonization.
So the Chinese Communist Party is a colonial hegemon.
Oh yes, of course. So, but the problem is it's not only just the communist problem. We have double problem. One is communism, Chinese Communist Party, of course. The other one is colonization. I mean, this is just so. Even after the Chinese Communist Party regime collapsed, there's still a big question. The Mongolians and Tibetans need to be free. Doesn't matter which regime replaced the communist regime. Our top priority is how to free ourselves from the Chinese colonization, not just fighting the communism.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.